and kick us off just so that we can get through. The goal is to all have a conversation with these three amazing people up front, but definitely want to open it up so we can have conversation and dialogue with folks, those of you who've come to join us. So welcome. My name is Lucretia Murphy. I'm an Associate Vice President for Jobs for the Future and lead our Center for Justice and Economic Advancement. And today we're really here, I think, for Kysha, for Chris to kind of share a little bit about our organization's journey in one particular area that we focused on with language, and to have Clair here with us to share kind of some larger frameworks from her expertise. A lot of us have read her work, which is inspiring our journey, and it might be that some of you have done so as well. So as I said, one of the things that is said earlier this morning, when JFF held its Horizon Summit in 2020, we had to go from in-person to virtual, but we also had to do some soul searching. What were we or what were we not doing in this moment of racial reckoning to put us on the side of right? And one aspect of the work that we started looking at was the language that we used and how we used language, and to really understand that language can either empower and educate, or it could start to promote inequity in subtle ways and in explicit ways, but nevertheless we had some power that we were not paying attention to. So internally at JFF, we kind of kicked off what we call language matters, to really think about the words we use, the terms we use, how we used phrases, how we were or were not engaging with people in the products that we wrote, who was leading the development of concepts and themes, to make sure that we were really being a partner to and learning from the field. And so that has kind of kicked off a journey for us. And I know it's a similar reaction for Kysha and Chris, so I'm going to turn it over for them to talk as well. Kysha Frazier is a colleague with Corporation for Skilled Workforce. I only say CSW. Yeah, I don't even really know what it stands for. Yeah. Chris Wattler for the Center for Employment Opportunities in New York. Their bios, everybody's bios are in your app, so you can see how amazing they are. But Kysha, do you want to talk a little bit about y'all's experience as well?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me here, Cree. And one of the ways that I connected with Cree was actually as CSW. We're a nonprofit workforce organization. We do policy and research similar as a peer with JFF. And our REI, our Racial Equity Inclusion team, wanted to reach out to peers of ours to have this conversation, so I invited Cree in, and we had a discussion about language. So I'm happy, we're continuing that discussion. But language matters, I think, as we got the title. It is very fluid, and one of the ways that you are able to better understand it is you got to get in where you fit in, is how I got to say it. It means you have to jump into it and really have conversations with the people that you're working with or that you're serving. And so really that means instead of working on groups and giving them solutions, it's working with groups and having them really drive the solutions that you want to bring forward. And so one of the ways that we primarily been incorporating this idea of how do we look at language is through participant voice and deep collaboration. And so, but to get there, we had to do a couple things first internally. We couldn't just jump there and say, oh, let's talk about language. We had to really look internally, and we worked with a consultant starting in 2019. We're headquartered in Ann Arbor, but we've got folks all over, but we chose someone in Ann Arbor to work with as a consultant. And we looked at first our mission and values, and we made changes to that and really looked at how do we explicitly name the groups that we're targeting for our work. We looked at our values, and instead of using, code words about vulnerable populations, this and that, we just named, let's say what it is and be explicitly focused on that. We pulled out and made one of our values to say race and opportunity. It wasn't folded into something else. And so we started there really looking at the culture. Followed by that, we really looked at how our hiring processes and procedures and wanted to make sure that we strengthened our candidate pools. We looked at pay equity internally. We post our wages for the various job positions. We post the wage ranges on our job descriptions too, to ensure that there's pay equity across the board. And then we intentionally are growing our organization to change its composition to better reflect, again, the populations in which we work with. It's not happening like that. We made progress and change. I could say our staff composition racially has grown nearly 40% in the last year. So it can happen. There's not major things you have to do that are like, oh, this is going to cost us $10,000 or 10 years to do it. This can happen incrementally in short periods of time if you're intentional about it and focused. Another thing that we've done, we've created a supportive culture as well, and we have a rotating REI staff team. So everyone within the organization is going to be leading what we're doing around racial equity and inclusion and leading staff training and development. And this happens every month. We do staff training. Another thing I would just say is that we have developed a set of staff competencies that are measured for each person within the organization, their REI competencies that are part of their job performance. And of course, we've got KPIs for the organization. So there's a number of other things, but these are things that we've done intentionally over the last 2 years or so to set up a culture that enables this idea and concept around language to happen. Because you might say, well, it doesn't have to do with language. It's really creating that environment to enable that culture and the conditions for us to think about the work that we do. And it's creating that welcoming environment so that you can be able to have and listen to people, to hear what they have to say, really understand how do they want to express what they have to say, and how do they want to say it. And so that's kind of setting that up. And from there, we're working more to create guidebooks and tools like you all have at JFF. And we've learned a tremendous amount from Clair, and I'm going to plug her work that kind of started some of this in our discussion too. It's the workforce development field, or a conduit for maintaining systemic racism. If you have not read that report, please do so. And from studying that work, we were able to identify 8 different areas of focus that support racial economic opportunity in language, and looking at expressing language and self, and asset-based language is a part of one of those 8 different areas of focus for us. So that's what I'll say for now.
I'm going to turn it over to Chris, too, if you want to give just a little overview of what your process has been and how you all are looking at language in the context of your work.
Sure, thank you. And so good to be with everyone. I think these topics sometimes can feel very heavy, and folks are kind of hesitant. The one thing I want to say is, to be brave and courageous, like this, thinking about language and how to create a culture that's inclusive and equitable requires some bravery, some courage. I work for the Center for Employment Opportunities. We serve people coming home from incarceration, helping to connect them to jobs. It's a group of human beings that are highly stigmatized in our society. And particularly many of our, what we describe as participants in our program, are individuals who are Black and brown, come from communities with high rates of poverty. And when we think about who we are serving as an organization at CEO, we have always felt like, wow, yeah, we're a diverse organization. We're an organization that's committed to honoring people when they come through our doors, helping them to feel comfortable. And so like a lot of nonprofits in this space, you assume that you are doing good work until you find out otherwise. I think the racial reckoning in the country really, in 2020, really excited like our staff. They began to really interrogate us, the leadership of CEO, asking us tough questions, both about what are we doing, around these important issues. And so as an organization, it really accelerated some work that was already underway at CEO. And as Kysha mentioned, we have done a lot of work around equitable structures, our compensation, so compensation analysis, looking at position leveling and how people can progress in the organization. We've been scaling. When I started, we had 13 sites at CEO. In 2016, we have 30. now. So thinking about equity and inclusion as we grow, and seeing that as really central to who we are. Our journey began really thinking about participant feedback. So we were one of the initial investees of the Listening for Good initiative, and we built a very robust feedback system at CEO to listen to the people we were serving and to close the feedback loops, the things that they were saying, whether it was a compliment or a complaint, making sure that we were getting back to them and having multiple ways that we could listen to folks. So even as an executive in the organization, I could go in and see data about feedback, see our NPS score, see how we're doing. So you begin by listening to people and responding to what they say, but the work that we have been doing in the last few years has really elevated our participants, really thinking about, and I think about this both internal and external. Internally, it means elevating DEI, and I like to think about DEI not as a program, but as a way of being. It is kind of becoming and belonging, who we are, like getting to that point where you say, this is who we are. It's not something we're doing, although there are activities, it's who we are. Like talking about that, we reframed our values to really think about equity and inclusion, and in particular began really looking at what happens to our colleagues who are justice impacted, who are either former participants of our program or came to CEO with backgrounds. We are open hire shop, so we hire anyone regardless of their background if they're qualified to do the work. So you do that kind of internal structural work and that internal cultural work, and then you need to align to the message that you're putting out to the world. So in 2020, our staff was asking us, what are we saying? What's our voice? And I'll tell a true story. We have affinity groups at CEO. One of them is called Justice Involved Voices. I'm one of the executive kind of mentors and leads for that group. So I'm there to support that staff group. They came to our CEO and gave some feedback and said, when everyone comes to CEO, they get an ID number. And so when they walk in an office, the first thing we do is ask them for their ID number, not their name. What is that like? It's like prison, right? It's like jail. So we shifted the way that we greet people when they come in the office. You no longer come in or known by this ID, you're known by your name. And that is something that we missed because we built a system that was just designed to efficiently get people in, but we weren't thinking about the humanity of the people coming in and that message that you're more than a number, you're more than an ID. So it's an example of the journey that we're on, and it's still a journey. We still have work to do as an organization, but I think you need intentionality, you need courage, and you need to really involve folks in the conversation in your culture.
Mm-hmm. And just to pick up on that, I think as we think about the journey, one of the things that we've all been activated by is work by Clair Minson. And I think that I hear her voice on my shoulder when I'm writing things or saying things. But Clair, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of why you think this is so important, and kind of maybe share for those who haven't yet read your work or had the fortunate opportunity to work with you as a consultant, what it is that it's not just because we have to say a certain thing on a list. What is it that we're doing by changing our language?
Yeah. Grab this on here. It's also great to be here echoing Chris's comments. I heard someone say in a session earlier today, data makes you credible and stories make you memorable. And it was powerful, and we can deconstruct that later, right? We could dissect that in a lot of different ways, but the point is that stories are powerful, right? And stories are compiled by the use of language. And so I like to think about this conversation around language in two parts. So language, AKA the words that we use, and then language vis-a-vis the stories, right? Or the narratives that we shape and we tell. And I think all of us know in order to get money, to change policy, to engage employers, you have to craft and tell a story. The challenge is we can't separate the use of language from the historical context of this country in America, particularly the ways in which race and racism has shaped who we think are worthy, who we think are not worthy, who we think are valuable, who we think have skills, who we think do not have skills. And so in the conversation about language, we have to think, is this language oppressing or oppressive? Is this language empowering, or the stories empowering? And whose vantage point are we sharing, and whose vantage point are we not sharing? And in particular, I like to think of it in language can oppress or it can liberate. And who is it oppressing and who is it liberating? So when I facilitate sessions about the manifestations of racism in workforce development in particular, I think about it in 5 ways, with language and narrative being the linchpin. It is the thing that every other piece of our sector, is the way that information is carried, that biases are shared, whether intentional or not, through the stories that we tell. And so if we really want to have a system that is going to move us away from being a conduit for racism to being one that actually advocates and advances racial equity as a societal goal, then we have to examine the language that we use. Language was created in the context of racism to craft a story around who was valuable and who wasn't. And so how is that showing up in our society today? How is that showing up in the work that we do today when we talk about the people that we're working with? I think Chris's story was powerful in shifting from ID number to a name, right? The work of racial equity and the work of racial justice is about honoring our shared humanity. How are we as people seeing other people? How are we valuing other people? How are we honoring other people? And how do we do that in the speech, in the language, in the stories that we tell? And more than that, how do we allow people the space to tell their own stories in their own words without feeling the need to shape it and form it and frame it in a way that is palatable for everybody else, right? So I'll pause there, but I just wanted to offer that, the stories that we tell. I mean, that quote was so perfect. I couldn't have timed that better, because stories are memorable, but whose stories are we sharing and how are we sharing them, and how are we sharing power even in that framing of stories for folks who we're working with?
Well, and you set it up perfectly, because as we think about language, it's also happening in political and public social context, right? And one thing, as Claire was talking about narrative, and I'm going to put this over to Chris, is that narrative isn't static. And once it's out there, it's owned, right? How many times do we hear Martin Luther King said, "I will not be judged by the color of my skin, but the content of my character"? Everybody says it. Very few people are saying it the way he meant it. You can't own it now that it's out there. And I think that one of the things that we see is, even as we work hard to craft civil rights language, or how we work hard to craft liberatory language, it can be used then to oppress. It can be shifted. And I want to turn this over to Chris, because we see this a lot now in the context of justice reform and in the context of ending mass incarceration or improving reentry. So I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about how your team is, how you're hearing it now and starting to deal with that, owning the narrative again.
I think a lot about this topic, and something I mentioned to the panel. The last administration in Washington had an executive order. I pulled it up here because I wanted to get the name right. Executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. That's the title of it. Sounds very civil rights. Wow, inspirational. But when you read it, the order, what it was essentially saying is federal contractors and federal agencies could no longer teach about anything about the history of oppression in the country. It would mean that certain words, anything that made anyone uncomfortable, couldn't be taught for a federal contractor or agency. But the way that the order is written, it sounds very much like a civil rights document, right? It uses language about the aspirational language of everyone being equal, everyone being valued, but it dismisses the truth about American history, and it really was attempting to kind of cut off the dialogue that we all need to have around our country and our nation, how to advance together, as we heard Ms. McGee talk about. And to me, it is a wonderful case for how the very language that I've grown up with and been so committed to can be just turned in a way that for people like me could be deadly, essentially. And so when we, think about language, certainly in my work, and you hear it a lot too around justice reform, like tying the reforms to shootings, right? The powerful in our nation, whether it's police departments or mayors or elected officials, saying, this thing happened and it's because we ended bail, or it's because we are doing diversion, So that's concerning to me, because what we need are narratives that I think are, speak the truth. We talk about data on one hand, but when we use data to support oppressed people, that it gets dismissed. And so the data on bail reform, for example, is that it is not a contributor, a big contributor to crime, and there are a whole host of other things we should look at. Not forgetting the fact that bail is not designed as a criminal justice tool to take people off the streets. It's supposed to be to get people to come back for their court appearance, which it does very well. We do not need to continue to, use money bail, cash bail, to get people to come back to court. And it's particularly, we're in New Orleans, I'll tell you because I know intimately, this was a state where I learned the term bail or jail, fine or time. That's how the justice system operates around the country too often. And so when we think about the language around that, how do you tell stories that are different? What does that look like? And in my work, we talk a lot at CEO, we're kind of on this journey. You also have to ethically source your stories. You don't just strip mine stories from the work you're doing and hold up people's lives and stories and tell stories about them without them. You have to really invest the time to say to someone, we'd love to share your story, and to give them agency and choice as to whether or not that story gets shared or not. Give them the opportunity at any point to say, I know I said I'd do this, but I don't want to do this anymore. And to make sure they review the finished product, to do these things so that you're ethically developing stories. Too often in my sector, certainly at CEO, we would tell great stories about all the wonderful people who benefit from the amazing, what if but for CEO, poor Johnny would not have gotten 1 year retention. I don't want to devalue our work. It's important work. But what's more important is, who is Johnny? What were Johnny's hopes and dreams? What did Johnny think about what Johnny needed? And did he get it at CEO? And if he didn't get everything he wanted, can that be part of the story too? And the answer should be yes. So we have to think about how we're kind of elevating these stories and putting our clients, folks say consumers, whatever the different language that we have. I just say people that come to us, to be a part of our community, making sure that we're elevating, their stories. And the way that I like to put it for anyone is, how would you like your story told? When you think about yourself, right, because we're all the hero in our own drama, right? And stuff. The family, like my family, everyone's right, no one's wrong, and stuff, except for me, right? So think about how you would want your story told, the important things about your life, the struggles, the things you've been able to overcome or that you deal with day to day, the hidden things that maybe other people don't know, and how powerful it is that you exist and that you are here. And imagine people who are oppressed and marginalized wanting to have that same sense that their story matters, I think is critical. So in my space in particular, it's so important for us to begin to shift the narratives, how we're talking about the work we're doing and the policies, to move language away from the problem people. So when I don't like the term justice involved anymore. This is a term I used to use liberally to distinguish that some people were involved in the justice system as if it's their fault only. I say justice impacted. It puts the onus on systems and policies that are impacting human beings. And that's a different way to think about it. And when you talk to the people who are impacted by the system, the stories they tell are not I wanted to go to prison, I wanted to go to jail, or I wanted to be abused as a child. That's not their story. Their story is, things have happened to me and I am trying to do the best that I can, and things get in the way of that. So we should follow their lead and focus on really supporting them and helping them, but at the same time, these systemic barriers, these are things we can solve as a society. I love Ms. McGee, what she was talking about, that's collective problem solving. I know that I can have grandkids someday, and I can say to them, we had mass incarceration, we fixed it in the United States. It's a fixable problem, but we're only going to do that when we put the narratives and the leadership of people who are directly impacted. I talked too long, but
The work that you all are doing to rethink how you define success, rethink how you rethink research in order to kind of get to those narratives.
Sure. So as a workforce policy organization, a research organization, we definitely think about these things. And like I said, not working on people, but working with people. And so one of the things that we've done is really focusing on incorporating participant voice. And so one of our directors is a fellow of the feedback labs, and their purpose and thinking is that the solutions are driven by the people and their experiences. There's nobody else better to do that. And so we've started to think about how do we include that design into our initiatives, not at the outset, not just a focus group once the work is going, but a design at the beginning. And so starting with one of the projects we're doing is with the Michigan Justice Fund. It just so happens to be that way. We're working with that organization, and we've actually have incorporated and have one of their fellows as a part of our research team. So this person is not in a focus group. They're at the start of the meeting, they're crafting, they're a partner of ours throughout the whole work, their staff. And so that's going to help us design the right research questions from the outset. Are we asking the right kinds of questions? Are we saying them in the right way? As we design a focus group, what are the right questions? Who should be leading that and asking those questions? Once we get to that point of collecting the information and data, as we think about how it's going to be measured, what are the metrics? What are the right metrics? The funder might say this, but what are the ones that the community and this population really cares about? We're also thinking about then how do you report that information? What does that look like? Again, how do you want to say it? Like Chris says, how do you want to share this information and report it? Who are the right groups that should hear it? We might traditionally think of the folks who need to hear this. Who else needs to be at the table and in the room to be hearing this? And so those are some things that we're doing. Also, we've created a number of tools like around LMI, labor market information toolkits too, giving the power of understanding your data and using that data back into the hands of the people, again, that we're working with is critical. So then they can then go back and say, this is how I understand the data and how I want to report the data and how it's impacted me. So it's giving people the power and, again, giving power back into the place where it really should reside with the people who have the solutions to the issues that are happening. They're the best people to really drive and make resolution. And I just want to say it's interesting when you mention names, just what you were doing in your organization. We don't work directly with participants. We're more of an intermediary to help at the federal, state, or local level. But this idea, a name is very important. It's personal, and language is I think it hits us at a lot of different ways, but personally for me as well. As I even meet people, you are sitting up here with a panelist who has a more creative name. I'm often called Kysha, which is not, it's a very beautiful name too. It means favorite one. It's not that, but allowing people to even name themselves. I didn't, 3 generations ago, I didn't have the opportunity, my family didn't have the opportunity to even name themselves. So that's very personal to give power back to people to even be able to name themselves. It recognizes their humanity, their dignity. And so again, that language to just first name yourself, but then to go on and say, name the work and name what's important to me. And naming the impact it has in my community is important. So this idea of language can be as much as, like Chris said, not a number, but a name. It's also just, could be changing a letter from black to blacks, or blacks to black is what I mean, or the black people. It's all those sorts of things. You just got to think about putting people first and people-centric. And so that's where we're going in terms of our research, thinking about being people-centric. That's the most kind of principal rule we have. If you have a question, ask the people that you're talking. Ask them. Don't assume, don't guess. If you're people-centric, that's going to lead the way, and that's kind of the best approach to go about as we're thinking about the work and how we do it.
Claire, I'm going to let you kind of wrap us up, but there's one tension. Claire's an amazing woman, a dear friend of mine, but she will get you. There's one, she will always get you. And Claire, I wonder if you can talk about the big get that you always tell me, who is benefiting and who is not benefiting. And I think so often in our work, particularly in workforce development, we've all said it. What does the employer want? Map back from what the employer wants. What does the funder need? That's your metric of success. And Claire's always like, no, that's really not true. So I wonder if you can wrap that in, because it ties into where Chris and Kysha were both saying, maybe we need to rethink the narrative based on who's most impacted instead of other stakeholders. So if you can tie that into then what
I will do my best.
Exactly.
So I think Chris named it already. In typically, traditionally, historically, the way we've told stories is, right, but for this organization, this person would not be able to do X, Y, and Z. And Ibram Kendi, in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, talks about assimilationist ideology. And so we can't deconstruct, we can't reimagine language if we don't understand historically how it's been used and the ideology that underpins language. And so in an assimilationist ideology, it's this belief that people's behaviors or skills need to be changed in order for them to survive or thrive in a particular context. And so if we think about the work that we do in job training, traditionally it's about shifting behaviors so that folks can survive and thrive, but we leave out the because of race, because of racism, you have to navigate workplaces and society in a particular way. When you give people choice to say, how do you want to navigate, right, rather than being forced to assimilate and change, fundamentally shift who you are, even that assimilation to navigation, even the difference in that language empowers and or oppresses, right? And so you can't do the work of reimagining without understanding the historical context. So as much as I try to do the micro learnings and say, let's think about historically, how's this language been used? And yes, to Cree's point, who is it serving and who is it not serving? If the story is not ultimately serving the individual, then it's serving the organization. And then to what end? And then are we saying the organization is better than the individual? Like how are we then thinking about power dynamics? In my work as a therapist, when I work with individuals, I say, you are the authority in your life. I have no idea what your experiences are. You are the authority. And so my job may be to hold up a mirror, to guide you, to connect some dots. And I think that's our work, right? It's not to say, I know better than you in your life. You are the authority in your life as an individual. The experiences you have, I have not had. The way you've had to navigate the world, I have not had. I can offer my input, I can offer suggestions, maybe I have a little bit of more insight into what this particular industry might want or need versus this particular industry, but I can't tell you what you know best about yourself. And so my qualm about the data piece was sometimes we think certain quantitative data is better than qualitative data, right? We talked about lived experience as really important, but when people talk about the lived reality of racism, we deny it. And so that was kind of my qualm about, data is credible, it is, but even in that, we decide who gets to determine which data is credible and who doesn't. And typically, that is very directly connected to the hue or the color of their skin, but that's not because of the individual, it's because of the system that we're operating within. I hope that answered your question. I know I said a whole lot. There was one other thing that I wanted to add, just look at my notes because they keep me on track. I think many of you may have heard about Travian Shorters at BME Community and the work that he's doing around asset-based framing, right? And so if we're doing the work of equity, it means we're working on the fruit and the root. We're talking about the manifestations and the ways in which racism, we see it showing up in outcomes in the data. But we also have to look at the root causes, right? What are the policies? What are the institutional practices? And what is the cultural messages, AKA cultural racism? That's how cultural racism is formed and perpetuated through our language and through our stories. So if we're really going to get to equity and we understand equity as one part of justice work, then we have to look at some core root causes, and language is at the core, if not the core, holding up huge parts of the work, huge kind of pieces of racism, if you will, and what is our responsibility or culpability in not critically examining language. And so I'll use one more example. When I worked in Baltimore, we were at a table around, it was a public workforce system convening partners around systems building, and we had this conversation, we were talking about grassroots organizations, and I paused and said, what do we mean when we say grassroots? What are we implying? And why is there an expectation that the way I'm using grassroots is the same way that you're using grassroots, and we have this assumption that it means the same thing, but who are we really talking about? And Kysha, you mentioned this earlier, how can we be really explicit about the groups we're talking about, the context that they're navigating, and the ways in which they have to navigate without implying something or making an assumption that you understand what I mean when I say this thing. And I think sometimes we get into that shorthand because we want it to be simple, but we're complex beings as humans, and the world we live in and who we are not simple. So we can't distill a story about an individual to something simple because it's convenient for us.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's one lesson. Our Director of Editorial Services, Carol Gerwin, is here, and I think that's one very simple but hard lesson that we've been working on at JFF, because the lesson of writing is be succinct. Mm-hmm. But succinctness drives a certain narrative, right? It drives a certain level of labeling, but the only people that get labeled are folks who are already marginalized. It drives a certain level of convenience and neutrality, right? I'm not trying to disparage. We only have 100 characters. We only have 500 words. We got to get it all in there. And the question we've been toying with, Carol has developed a really nice Language Matters guide for us, and people are saying, I need the right word, or I need a word that's shorter, and one of the lessons is people first. It's got to be people first. It's no longer it's got to be the most succinct, it's got to be the most people-oriented. And I think that one thing it presses us to understand is then, why does a marginalized community bear the burden of succinct language? Where do we need to shift those other words so that we can say Black and Latinx students instead of students of color? Because we don't mean all students of color.
Right.
And so where are the other places that we take those words from, as opposed to assuming that by calling them students of color, minority students, we have done no harm, and we are impartial, and we're just being succinct. And I think those are lessons that, as you start writing, I told Claire that I was writing a proposal about higher ed in prison, and Claire kept saying, well, why do you say higher ed? Like, what is it higher than? What are you signaling? And I was like, I'm trying to get this in 100 words or less. That's why I'm saying it. But so then I'm writing post-secondary education in prison, because it's the sequence that's important. It's when it happens that's important.
Right.
So then, that's a lot of, so I went back to say I'm talking about post-secondary education in prison, in parentheses, PEP. But without that push, I would have not been investigating what is signaled by higher ed, particularly if there are other pathways that people are taking for their opportunities. And so it is those constant tensions, and it's fluid, and just like everybody mentioned, the more you talk to the participants you work with, the more problematic your language becomes, the more work you have to do, the less succinct you get to be, and then, but it's that turmoil that we should be feeling, not the participants that we're working with need to, every time they read one of our articles, or, you write about them and say, oh, here, show this to your family. I'm like, why would I show my family something that referred to me as a marginalized youth? That's not my story.
Yeah.
So I do think it matters that we are the ones wrestling as we produce it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over for you all to ask folks, share your experiences. Go ahead.
So I work in nonprofit.
Do you want to say your name and where you work in case people want to know?
Velasquez from Tucson Metro Chamber in Southern Arizona. So my question really is around language in the sense of you mentioned like character limits. You've got this donor-centric model of securing dollars. So my frustration is, obviously, I want to move into the community-centered way of getting dollars. So can you demonstrate examples, whether they've been successful, not successful, of how to move and pivot to that? I would love to hear some strategies around that have worked in your areas. And I know it's a long road. I know sometimes you got to do a little of both to get to where you want to go. But I'm just curious about any strategies that you've used to kind of move to that.
Do you want to start? Anybody want to take it?
Yeah, we started an inclusive hiring initiative at CEO, right? So we prepare people for employment and then we send them to employment partners. That's all very supply side. But what we realized is, I could open up 100 offices. There's 600,000 people coming home from prison. We have the capacity to serve about 10,000 now. And we get pats on the back for that, which is, hard work for an organization. But we're not going to shift the game. And so we started thinking about, well, what about the demand side? How do you get the employers to change? What do we have, something like, 11 million job openings in the country? What if all of those job openings opened up? That's scale, in my work. If I got all employers to stop denying opportunity to people because of their past convictions, that's scale. So we worked with SHRM and their Getting Talent Back to Work program to create a new curriculum for them. Videos, 10 hours, it's free. And you can also get continuing education credits. And intentionally, that video is produced led by a colleague of mine who's justice impacted, who led that project. It involved other justice impacted leaders. We created that content to help HR professionals understand exactly what they needed to do in their companies, in their organizations, to begin to reframe, reimagine, how hiring can be in the organization. So that's an example of just creating like tools. Let's just say there's this kind of large problem, it's on the demand side, it's embedded in HR, right? Talent has a role here, they can be leaders here, but they need help. And so you have to give them tools and language and curricula that helps them to do that. So that's an example of looking at our mission and our strategy, realizing that our strategy, if we kept going, CEO could be around for 100 years, still doing the work, feeling very good about it, but we're not going to change the overall dynamic until we look at the demand side and say, well, how do you shift the policies that prevent people from working? How do you build communities with employers to get them to do that? And, in 2020, those conversations began in earnest because lots of companies started making lots of promises around racial equity. Some stuff's happened, but not a lot. And I think we are at a moment in the country where we have to kind of think big, interrogate these structures. It's not easy work, but I think one strategy is create, we heard earlier, partnership or die. I think, what we heard in the first plenary and yesterday, that's resonating with me. We need to create communities. I keep calling the demand side work a movement. My friend Harley is here from Honest Jobs. There are a whole bunch of folks who are trying to push on this. So it's not a matter of what to do, it's the will to do it. And we need to create the tools and support. I thank JFF for this forum and this work, and to be on a panel with some amazing, we're all here doing the work. So the SHRM project is one example of how you can build a partnership focused on trying to educate people. And we've had over 5,000 people take, and complete that curriculum. Another 57,000 have interacted with the site. So we're leveraging scale there just in terms of helping people to learn.
One thing that we started doing in our proposals, particularly when we're doing proposals around talent development, right, is, as Claire instructed, we no longer call people job seekers, job candidates, right, because that's what you are. We talk about people as talent, because if I, that's what they call people who work at Google. Mm-hmm. So why wouldn't that be what they call someone who's going to the web, right? You're just starting to change the language, little terminology changes. Another thing that we did was to start every proposal with the person's story. It's a story that's been vetted, it's a story that's been cleared. but it's a story of that person as the hero of the program. And then from there, as you talk about data, it's tied to systemic failures. The fact that disproportionately people who are incarcerated are Black is a system failure. Because of the system, people who are incarcerated are disproportionately Black and Latinx. So you just shift a lot of the framing so that data isn't a litany of what's wrong with Black people. And then you get to but we got a program for them. You're just kind of shifting from the very beginning. And I think that's, again, where it takes a lot more time to not have a series of bullet points.
Quickly, setting the data and the context is very crucial, and definitely a proponent of that. Another thing is, I'm not sure if this was a part of your question, Frank, but having building strong relationships with funders to have those conversations, and that's something we've been doing a lot, and pushing funders to say, hey, that's your metrics, that's what you, but have you vetted that? Have you talked with the communities? Is this what's important? So one example, we've been having conversations with United Way around, and they've been really smart about this too, as they even designed their RFPs for their grantees. They had the grantees weigh in on that RFP, for one. And then two, they've come to us to partner to think about the metrics that are going to be laid out for the grantees once they are selected. So I think there are some funders who are thinking this way too, and building those relationships and challenging it when, just say, hey, think about this. We're partners here. Partnership means equal power. So let's talk about the power we have in making some decisions about what this work looks like.
And I'll just add one thing, because I know there might be another question, but it starts with you. You have to decide, what is my belief system around language and how it's used? Is my belief system around equity? And then what am I willing to push on and what am I not willing to push on? What risks am I willing to take? Because we're talking about kind of taking risks with funders, right? And so then it goes down to your value. If my value is equity, if my value is justice, and I'm committed to this work, do they share a similar value, and or are they willing to go on the journey with you, right? How do they respond when you push back and say, actually, we are reframing from justice involved to justice impacted? What's their response? And that's the signal to you. Is this a partner that I can truly walk along this journey with or not? So everything everybody said, and it starts with you all making a decision about where's your line going to be, where your parameters going to be, and how are you going to show up in the work.
And no one talks about boards, but just to mention, boards of directors, whether private or nonprofit, need to get them in the game. I think too often it's the staff, the leadership of organizations. We forget that actually the people responsible for institutions are the boards of directors, and we have to bring them into the game in a conversation on that.
So thank you for the opportunity to offer cheat sheet. But the other piece is just think about my name and having to correct people to say my name correctly all the time, and then now thinking about if you have a cheat sheet, how do we start to influence our colleagues to use it? And not going to the CEO say use the new word and use the old word, but how do we start to influence our colleagues to embrace the new language and make it the norm versus what the old way was? How do we start that?
So we've been doing it a couple ways, and then I'll let other people jump in when I get, again, attacked by coughing. But so we have, one, it's a collective group who volunteer to kind of think about what are the words, and the people from the organization are sending in their, I don't like the way we use this. So there's also organization buy-in into the fact that we're evaluating. There's a team of people who do the evaluating. And then our editorial team works with individual teams across the organization to kind of go through what it means to be people first and what are the tensions around that. So we do the organizational training repeatedly over time in smaller groups that are content or operation specific. So it starts to be considered in terms of your day-to-day work. So for example, I sat in on the one we did with the development team. And the development team would say, oh yeah, okay, so we get it. We can start using those words in our proposals. And they were the ones who said, but what happens when we only have 100 words? How do we, what do we sacrifice if we have a 100 word count? And that's when we start to investigate, well, why do we want to burden the people with the 100-word count? What are the other things? And so then, if people are looking at it in the context of their day-to-day, we found that that's been really helpful on our end. And we do it repeatedly because the organization grows, people come, people leave, so we do it repeatedly. I don't know other folks.
I'll just say we kind of hinted at in the story, like our affinity groups, we also have DEI ambassadors program. So staff are kind of raising their hand to say, yeah, I want to take on a leadership role. They also become, advisors, on policies and practices. And so the number to name thing is just one example. But I think the more that you create a culture where there's transparency, where we do an annual survey of staff using a tool called Culture Amp, that really looks, and kind of explores several DEI questions. And I think it's really important to have that information for leadership in particular to know what you should think about responding to. But I think, almost like an open source approach, right? Whatever tool you're developing, around language, like, yeah, let people know about it, let them have the opportunity to input, comment on it.
Carol with a K also told me about another tool that we'll add. We also added an editor's note. So one of the things we found, because we are a research organization and people use research, there are terms that may be used by the federal government in a data set, or another organization created a data set and they're using words that we wouldn't use. And so we put the data in there as it's developed, and then there's an editor's note that the team can use to say, JFF prefers to use the term black with a capital B, but you will see in this table, it's lowercase black as it was developed by the department. So you don't have to go through and correct DOL data. You just put that one editor's note in. So we've been experimenting with things like that too, that teams can use to make differences, particularly if there's something historical and now the society has changed, but you want to make sure it's accurate. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Kysha, Frazier, Clair, Minson, and Chris Watler. And thank you all for joining us.